Hey, I'm Olivia Wylie. I write my LGBT fiction under the pen name O.E. Tearmann with my co-writer. I am a landscaper by trade, bisexual, biracial woman.
I'm V.S. Holmes. I write sci-fi fantasy with a lot of queer characters. I'm genderqueer myself, and pansexual, equal opportunity lover, whatever. Yeah, I try and put that into my fiction as much as possible. And my day job, when we're not under quarantine, is as an archaeologist.
Hey guys, a lot of you already know me. I'm Jason LaVelle, and I write as Jason LaVelle. I write paranormal suspense thrillers, and I write a lot of horror, everything under the speculative fiction umbrella. I am a transgender person. If you want to know details, you could always ask me, but I would just go as genderqueer, which seems to be easiest for me. And I do write a lot of queer characters, and I try to make it a kind of a casual queer, so that the book itself isn't focused on being queer, but just on the characters living their lives.
One of the things that I always like to do with this show is I like to start out by reading the Wikipedia definition and then having our panel here hammer it or destroy it or embrace it. I mean, we found that a lot of times this is very, very close to what we all feel like is the actual genre, but I have a feeling this is going to be a little bit different. First off, because they don't label it as LGBTQ fiction. The only thing I could find that had a definition behind it was called gay literature. So I'm not so sure that's the greatest way to describe it, but here I'll read it anyway, and we can discuss that. Gay literature is a collective term for literature produced by or for the LGBT community, which involves characters, plot lines, and or themes portraying male homosexual behavior. The term is now used mostly commonly to cover specifically gay male literature, with the separate genre of lesbian literature existing for women. In a historical sense, literature, as we understand it, is fairly new innovation, and the current concept of homosexuality is even fresher from the cultural oven. It is no surprise then that gay literature or even gay characters in literature are so relatively new as to still be shiny.
This is not new. This is a part of being human. And we have recordings. I mean, not that Nero was a good guy, but Nero had a lover, and this is ancient Greece and Rome that I'm talking about, who was a boy, and when the guy died, he was not a boy, a young man, a slightly younger man, and
We would hope.
yeah, sorry. So he wrote poetry calling him my boy, and that's why I made the mistake. And I'm just immediately irritated by, oh, this is so new. No, it's being allowed to be talked about. And that was shut down by, well, people differ, but that was shut down for a long time, and it's coming back. It's not brand new. It's coming back.
I have a little bit of an issue of calling anything LGBTQ fiction or gay literature. Because what we're seeing is that people that always have existed are just existing in this fiction. And so I don't necessarily believe that it needs to be called out as LGBTQ fiction. You know, my fiction, I don't call as LGBTQ fiction or queer fiction, even though I have queer characters. They are just existing within the story that I'm creating. They're not, you know, while the characters are the focal point, it's not their sexuality that defines the story. And so I feel like this stuff should just be in with every other piece of fiction. There should be no reason just to call it out for having a queer character in it. And while I do agree that we should be proud of who we are and the representation we get, I also don't think that books that have queer characters belong in a different section or a different genre of the bookstore or library. I just don't.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I think so. This sort of relates back to Olivia. So when I first read The Hands Were Given, which is O.E. Tearmann, there's this warning, this note in the beginning, and it's sort of saying, just so you know, there are queer characters, and I mean that's not verbatim, but and I had at first this sort of visceral response of like, we don't need to warn people about our existence, and it sort of felt weird to me, almost like, oh, be careful, there's sex in this book, and like as if just our existence is explicit. And then I talked to Olivia about it, and sort of just like, oh, well, what was your thinking about this? Because like I knew that probably wasn't where either of them were coming from. And she did say like, oh, well, it's to avoid the people who are going to hate on it, like sort of to push them away, proceed at your own risk kind of thing. And also to attract people who maybe aren't sure if this is a book for them or that they can see themselves in, as sort of this is a safe space warning. And so I'm sort of two minds about it a little bit, because I do think like we don't need warnings for our existence, and queer people should be in books just in general because we exist. But also sometimes I think it's a little bit more of like, don't worry, you're here. Like, I promise you're here. And until it's more mainstream, maybe we need to use those as secondary labels, like not main genre labels. And that's sort of how I've been labeling my books, because primarily they're sci-fi or fantasy, but I do use, queer or gay or whatever, depending on the characters, as sort of a subset. And it is sort of a hard line to walk, because you don't want to warn people as if it's a bad thing, but you also want to be welcoming at the same point.
Well, as somebody who's read Strangers, I can tell you straight up right now that if you don't read this book, you suck anyway, because it's an awesome book. So, and it's an awesome book. Forget about whatever else. I like I said, I've always compared it to like an Aliens or something to that effect. So if you're a fan of that, regardless of what the characters do and who they are, that's what should sell you on that book, because it's
agreed.
phenomenal.
May I go off that point for a second?
Yes, please.
We have a third reason. So I write with a non-binary co-author. Their name is Nonir Amicidia, but we have a third reason that we're glad we have the content warnings in there now, and it's because at shows we've had several parents or teachers of middle schoolers walk up and go, "Oh, wow, an LGBT adventure story? I gotta get this for my kids." And we're like, no, what age? What age? Sex scenes. So now it's sort of our CYA, so that we don't have to explain to every parent of a younger person who's not really ready for that kind of sex scene. Not that it's a problem, but that it's not age appropriate. Now there's a warning in the front of the book that just says, if your kids are old enough, the warning was originally, we don't want to get 1-star reviews from people who say, "I didn't know there was sex in here." So you were warned ahead of time. We actually borrowed an idea from Gail Carriger, who puts this warning on all of her LGBT fiction, basically for that reason. You knew there was queer sex scenes in here before you started reading. Hush. And I love it for that reason. But now I'm kind of glad, because it's awkward when you have to explain in other ways. Don't hand this to your kiddos.
When we had our photo studio here, and we used to have my book set up there, and this is when I just had a couple novels published. And the second book I ever wrote, the title was Delia, and the title has changed since then. But there's a love story in it, and it's between two women. And when I first released it, for several years, I was almost embarrassed about this. And it's shameful for me. I mean, it hurts me to admit this, but so when people would come to the studio for their photos, and they'd ask me about the books, and I'd be telling them about it. I was like, well, but if you're really conservative, this might not be the right one for you. And I would kind of stumble through this weird speech about how there's a lesbian love interest. And looking back on it now, I was like, okay, so I was extremely insecure about being out as queer to anyone, especially where I live, which is extremely conservative. But
Ouch.
it's that same kind of thing where we're giving a disclaimer just for us existing. But then at the same time, if somebody comes in and they're like, "Oh my God, yeah, I've been waiting to read something like that," or "I would love to read that," then it's a good thing. So it is that weird kind of balance that you were just talking about, V.
Yeah.
And
It's based on like whatever your gut reaction is too. Like,
Yeah.
and I think using it as a secondary label works unless if the story is explicitly about being queer in some way. And but like I'm using the word queer just because it's easier for me and that's what I use. But if that makes other people uncomfortable, like don't feel like you need to use it for yourself. Just disclaimer there. I know it's sort of a controversial word still in the community.
We own that word. It's ours now.
Yeah,
Agreed.
yeah. And it does make some people uncomfortable, and that's fine.
I'm like V. I kind of like using queer, partly because it's never been thrown at me as a slur. And I know older generations, sometimes it's uncomfortable, especially older generations from the UK, because it was used as a slur in that time and place.
mhm.
But I do feel like it's the most comfortable term because, okay, we can say it, LGBTQ XXXXXX, everything else is a mouthful. And having one short word that is expansive is nice because then
Well,
you can just say I'm queer rather than I am laundry
I
list.
was going to say a lot of people, including some people even within the LGBTQ community, don't really understand all the different labels, I think. And I think it's sometimes safer to say queer because it's a little bit more all-encompassing. And then you're not fumbling over, oh, I don't exactly know what this means. Maybe I shouldn't use this term. And so I feel like queer is a safe word, but like V said, for the older community, it might not be because I mean I have some girlfriends that are a little bit older than I am, and that was used against them often, and so they are still quite sensitive about it. But I think that by and large we own it, and in fact on my podcast I had originally written out the description of it as stories from the LGBTQIA community, but then I changed it to queer because I was like, what, our community. I mean, in a lot of ways, our community is much more varied than the cis-het community, than the normative community. So there's so much to it, and there's so much being added and so many more things that are being discovered about this, process of being human and living that I think that queer is just a good overall term. But that's just my opinion.
And each to their own on a certain level.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm saying is to general folks, don't go after somebody because they use a word that you don't love yourself, as long as they're not being abusive in their terminology or harmful. If
or
somebody
referring to you specifically too.
Yeah, exactly. As long as, like, if you use quilt bag and this other person uses queer, get off each other's backs, please. We have bigger problems. We got to take care of each other.
It is becoming more socially acceptable. It's got a long way to go. There's no doubt about that. But it is a little bit more open and acceptable these days than it has been in past generations. And so I'm wondering, as authors who write in this specific, with this specific idea, is there more pressure on you now because it is more open and more socially acceptable, or do you feel like you've opened, because it's opened up, you can open up a little bit more as well?
I think the entire literary community is feeling more pressure to include more diverse characters in their work. And there's a really high standard for doing it well, which is important and for a good reason. And it's hard to strike that balance between staying in your own lane and also having your work represent what the world actually looks like. especially depending on what fiction you're writing, because if it's fantasy, like, and so I think there is pressure, but I think a lot of the pressure comes from writing these characters who are perfect. And I see a lot of people, specifically sort of from the trans community, and that might just be because that's a lot of who I follow, but a lot of people seem to feel like you have to write this unproblematic character. You have to write this perfect character. You have to write this person who never thinks really screwed up stuff about themselves, which I think we all think those things because we've internalized it, or we haven't really figured out what the heck is going on in our brains and our bodies. And
Or we're psychos.
right, I think that that's a huge problem, and I think also the push for own voices has led to a lot of outing, and I know that happens a lot with, like, I have a couple gay male characters that I write, and a lot of people think that straight women shouldn't be writing these gay male characters, and that's a whole can of worms, and it's really complicated.
We've
it's hard
always
because
written.
I look
Yeah.
right, yeah, but I mean, I look from the outside like a straight woman, and spoiler alert, I'm neither. And so for me, that's me exploring this male side of me, and sometimes I feel like a gay dude. And so I worry about that kind of rigid definition as far as who can write what stories. I think there's a lot of pressure about that.
Agreed. And especially in our multicultural world, our modern world, there are a lot of people who have more nuance to their character than what you assume they are. I mean, I'm speaking to my own experience as someone bisexual. I'm as pale as the moon, but I grew up on the Menominee Reservation. So there have been times where someone has said, you're not supposed to talk about that. And I've been really tempted to tell them to fuck off in Menominee because I speak 3 languages and I've gotten really rusty on 2 of them, but I still know the words for fuck off. But speaking to the point, I'm going to use the Spider-Man line. With great power comes great responsibility. We are so lucky to live in a time where we can openly ask questions. We can openly discuss things. And so it is our responsibility to take on that work, take on the humility to say, hey, I'm trying to learn. Can I ask someone who has the time and the energy about X, Y, and Z? It's our responsibility to do that research because we can. And there were other generations who couldn't. There were other generations who never got the chance to ask the question, much less get an answer. So with that freedom that we have, it's our responsibility to do it. And it's worthwhile work.
I would really like more middle grade fiction that has queer characters in it. And I know there's some, but I do have a reason. That reason is that I have an 11-year-old daughter, and her and her friend group they all identify as some form of queer. And one of her good friends, who she had a little bit of a crush on, and who the crush was reciprocated, was just told by her parents that she had to change schools immediately, that she would not be here once schools reopened. And so we're like, what the hell is going on? And so through a lot of digging, we found out that the parents didn't like her friend group because none of them were straight. And I think that, and that sucks. And that's a story that many of us have heard many times, unfortunately. And, my daughter is pretty devastated, as are the rest of her friends, of course. But I would love her and for her friends to have more fiction that they can just say, hey, I can relate really well to this.
Jason, I have something for you.
Oh, wonderful.
This is the Tea Dragon Society. It is a very sweet, very gentle comic series where a lot of problems get worked out in non-violent ways. And the main characters are these 2 little sweethearts who have a crush on each other.
Aw.
And the main, I suppose I can call them the main elders in the group, these two gentlemen who are a long-term couple and basically married. And it's interracial, it's interspecies, because Eskiel is a type of sentient dragon and his guy is human. And the two young ladies who are figuring things out, and they just have the cutest little crush on each other.
Just people that may or may not be queer living their lives. And some authors that do that very well. Any of you know who Jacqueline Carey is, a fantasy author?
Yep.
Okay. And a lot of her books have queer characters in it, but the books aren't about being queer.
In my own work, I write several identities that I am definitely not, and I've tried to be very careful to do it sensitively. And what one of our main characters is a trans guy, Aiden, and so when we're writing him, now Nonir has a lot more direct knowledge of the trans community than I do, just because that's who they work with a lot. But they said that they weren't completely sure of some stuff. So we went on a group called Queer Sci-Fi, which is really great. And we asked the admins, can we throw out a request for a beta reader? Because we're writing this. And excuse me, not beta reader, sensitivity reader. And we found an amazing guy who is a trans man named Alex Silver, who also is a writer. And he's been reading for us. And he's been amazing. But we're so lucky to have these communities where we can ask the questions. So now we can, so now we do.
My current work in progress, one of my characters is Ace, or a romantic, and it's something I was feeling my way through, but I didn't really know that much about it. So I actually reached out to an author that I don't know on Twitter, who posts often about their sexuality and their writing. And so I sent them a message and said, hey, I've got some questions. Would you mind if I asked? And they were like, yeah, go ahead. So I asked all these questions about relationships and this and that, and, little details here and there. And they were great with answering. And I feel like that's something that, like you said, Olivia, no one had before us. We didn't have access to that kind of information. And I think that, it's important for us to do our best to do that research. Sometimes we're going to screw things up. We F things up. It happens.
We're human.
We're human. And when we do, we've got to do our best to make things right. And I think that it's important for everyone to remember, whether you're an author, whether you're a queer person or not, your presentation does not equal identity.
Or worth.
So, I occasionally get a little bit of feedback from people that I chat with, because I look like a 40-year-old straight white male. That's just what I look like. And there's not a whole lot I can do to change that. I've got a voice, I've got big, blocky shoulders and chest and a square jaw, which is a little bit actually rounded now, but that's how I present. That's not who I am. And I don't think anybody should, just assume that just because you look one way, that's necessarily who you really are, or don't have the experience or the knowledge to write or speak about anything else. There's a lot more beneath the surface with most of us, at least.
Oh man, as someone bisexual and biracial, I can completely speak to that. It's like, do not look at me and assume you know what I am and who I am. Please and thank you. And if you do, screw you.
I've had several emails. I don't get many angry emails, but I've had several emails about the book that I was telling you about, because I write primarily as women. It's just how I roll. And several people have told me, oh, you write like a girl and this and that. And then somebody was like, oh, are you trying to be a lesbian with all these lesbian scenes? And I'm like, well, you guys really don't have any idea who the hell I am.
My response to that is go fuck yourself, because no one else will touch you.
Right.
The interesting thing about this genre that I think is much different than any other genre, or I know we don't want to call it a genre because we want to mix in and The interesting thing to me is that this has a built-in fan base, and in a certain respect, some of them are not out there yet. Some of them are still hidden and, holding on to who they are and not, telling their story, which is perfectly understandable and perfectly fine for that to be. But as authors who are writing in their space and connecting to those people, do you feel like, is that what makes this genre very much different? Is that there has to be a level of protection that you have to go through with this?
Well, a little bit, and I actually have a kind of a story / question to relate to that for all of you here. I had a story idea in mind, and in this story idea, it was a graphic crime horror novel. I mean, very, very terrible stuff. It may be halfway written already, but my bad guy was actually a transgender woman. And so I asked a few people, I said, hey, what do you think of this idea? And I didn't expect it, but I actually got a lot of negative feedback from these people saying that, you shouldn't portray transgender people like that as a murderer, because it's going to make people think bad things about transgender people. And that was kind of the basic response that I got from a few people. And I was like, oh, well, but if it was anybody else, I would do it. And so I'm kind of in this weird place that I'm like, okay, well, yeah, I understand that. I don't want to bring any negative heat on our community, but I also want to write the story the way I want to write it. So where is that line of responsibility and creativity? How do you ride that line?
I think it depends on if they're the only character of that demographic. Sometimes, like in your work, I think that's sort of where I personally draw the line. Like, and I'll try and have more. I mean, I almost always have more than one queer character, and so I just make sure that the villain, so to speak, is outweighed. They aren't the only one of that identity, and that they're not the only queer person in the work. And I think a lot of people do that, but it is hard because it sort of goes back to what I was saying with, like, not everyone's perfect. Like, yes. There are bad people who happen to be trans or whatever, or gay, and like, that's just a thing, but
as long as that's not the only form of representation.
Right.
If it's, there was a time when you showed that a character was evil by giving them some physical deformity or strange proclivity, and it was a dark time, and we don't want that. But we have not enough yet, but we're getting to having plenty of characters from all demographics who show that we're all human. We all have good days, we all have bad days. Some of us go down dark roads. And it doesn't always matter where we came from so much as what we do with it. Yes, it shapes you. That idea of not being perfect is something that I really like to play with, and Nonir and I love playing with in our work. That essentially you don't have to be perfect to be cared about, to be supported by your community, to be loved. So we have one character who's very angsty about being gay, but his two best friends, who are a bisexual married to a lesbian, are just like, dude, you can say gay as hell, get over it. And they'll give him crap about it. And then they'll try to set him up with guys. And they're like, hey, do you want to date so-and-so from over here? And he's like, well, shut up. He's like, they're basically like a brother-sister relationship. So he's always like, I love you. Shut up. You're embarrassing me. And on a slightly more serious note, we do write Aiden dealing with a lot of dysphoria and a lot of anxiety and depression issues, partly from a hard life and partly from internal issues. And we wanted that in there because the whole point is, yeah, I have to take meds for mood stabilization. Yeah, I have panic attacks sometimes. Yeah, I have these problems, and I am still a good leader, somebody who's worth falling in love with, somebody who's worth listening to, somebody who's worth following. So yeah, there are passages from his point of view that are very dark and very internalized transphobia, very messed up. but the next chapter will be from somebody else's point of view saying, hey, this guy I love is having trouble. Hey, this friend of mine, I want to make sure he's okay. Basically showing you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be there for your community in the best way you know how. Everybody has some strength and everybody has a shitty day. And expecting us to be perfect in order to represent is an impossible ask for anybody from a marginalized group. It happens a lot to folks of color where they suddenly have to be perfect in argumentation, absolutely brilliant, all this other stuff just to measure up because they're being used as a monolithic representation for their community. It's like, dude, my car broke down and I had a shitty day. Give me a break. I'm human too. And treating us like humans is a huge part of normalizing.
Yeah. I think too, just about the villain thing, sort of building off what you said, I think also as long as, because the nuance of characters, as long as they're not the villain because of their identity, because they're gay or they're queer or, you know, they're a person of color, that's I think important too. Probably more important than also having other representation, I think.
Yeah, I think that you're hitting it right on the head there. And then because you don't want a situation like Silence of the Lambs, which is, man, a fantastic story. I absolutely love the story, but also horrifically transphobic. And I think the audience leaves knowing that, okay, the villain, this horrible psychopath, is a man that wants to be a woman. Okay, and so now you have that image in your head, and that's how you're going to go forward. So yeah, I agree. What's that?
And keep people out of bathrooms.
Yes,
when they really just need to pee.
Yes. So yeah, so we don't want that, but you know, so we're in a strange time right now where we are getting more representation, and I think that's wonderful. But you know, like you said, there is a level of responsibility, and we do have to take care in what we're doing, I think. But
Jason, you touched on this earlier. I did want to tackle this subject, and that is the future of, because this is growing and growing, and it's becoming more a part of, you know, where it's not, doesn't need to be categorized as its own genre, as we were talking about, but it's important to note that there is, you know, LGBTQ activity or characters or, you know, storylines that are going to be participating in a thriller or speculative fiction or fantasy novel, and so as that grows and it kind of blends back into just being part of the genre of a genre, where do you see the future going? Is that how it's going to be? Is that where we transcend a little bit, where it just blends into where I'm calling, you know, I'm calling these books science fiction and not, you know, LGBTQ science fiction.
I've stopped labeling, but I don't have any young adult fiction. I don't write young adult, so I don't feel a need to put any kind of warnings on it for young people or parents. But I decided after those couple of years where I warned people about my book who came to our studio that, you know, I'm not going to do that anymore. And you know, if I've got something that, you know, has sex scenes in it, you know, I might add something in the description about, you know, getting into a steamy situation, or I don't know, something like that, whatever, generic. And it is what it is. And it's funny is because I've tested it out on friends where I'll give them a book to read that maybe has a really intense sex scene between two people of the same sex, and wait for their feedback, and they'll be like, wow, yeah, that was a really good book. I really like the hot stuff in it, but not mention anything about the, you know, any kind of queerness. And I'm like, well, that's good. That's a win. I like it.
Nice.
I think I'm sort of doing a little bit what you're doing. I'm adding it more in the description itself. I did this with language because in my sci-fi, Nell has quite the mouth on her, and I was getting
in all sense of the word.
Yeah, like no one swears that much. I'm like, well, I promise you, I swear more than she does. So this is awkward. But I just
what endeared me most to her at the very beginning.
yeah. I just added like a foul-mouthed, you know, doctor of archaeology, and I think I'm gonna sort of start doing that a little bit more. And then I have the addendum in the description, but I don't have it in the book itself. You know, if you don't read the description all the way through, I'm sorry. And and I'm still going to keep labeling it that way because I think given the current political climate, I think until we see a little bit more equality going on, it's sort of more important to have that safe space for my readers, for me personally. But I do I can't wait until we have a time where it's just like, yeah, it's just a book, like a book.
Yeah, agreed. Well, and I'm still playing with it a bit, but circling back to what we said about safety, I've actually been reminded by some of my sensitivity readers to keep some of those notes of trigger warnings, partly because the community itself goes through so much crap that occasionally saying, yeah, there's going to be a bad guy in this book who's going to do some very transphobic or homophobic stuff, just so, not that the reader should put the book down, but hey, you're safe here, but brace yourself, so that they don't have the nasty shock. Because the warning for the mainstream community is mainly, you were warned, don't one-star me. But I do want there to be those notes in there for the queer community. Hey, we are going to discuss things that are very uncomfortable. Heads up, get ready, but it'll be okay, is kind of my thought process.
Nice.
And everybody approaches this differently, and I'm totally fine with that. But I have kept it because it's a scary moment when you hit something in the middle of a book where you were going along, enjoying it, and all of a sudden, oh God.
Yeah.
And it's nice to be able to give that warning to a community that's already dealing with trauma.
And that's so right. There's a scene in my first book that's it's a non-con scene. It's a rape scene, and it's horrible. It's an important part of the story, and yeah, I've had a couple people say, I really wish that I had a warning about this. And that's absolutely right, because we don't know what readers have gone through, and maybe something that you're about to say that doesn't mean much to you is going to really hit somebody hard, and we don't want that. I want to, since we've been talking about books and becoming mainstream, and I already kind of pointed her out, Jacqueline Carey, but I just want to say again, she is a fantastic fantasy author, and her newest book is called Starless. And it is absolutely wonderful. It just came out a couple years ago, and it's a book where gender and sexuality really don't mean shit.
Yay.
It's an action fantasy adventure, and it is absolutely incredible. It's got something that everybody will love. Sex and violence and all this crazy stuff, and it's just, but it's amazing because she was just like, gender, F it, I don't care, whatever. But so it's a good one.
As a middle-aged white heterosexual male, I had narrow scope in what I read. I didn't like YA. I'm still not a big fantasy guy, and there's other reasons why I'm not a fantasy guy. But as I'm doing what I'm doing with Going now, I've broadened my horizons a bit, and I've read a lot of women's literature over the last year that I've really, really enjoyed. And I've come to find that there's something that I've learned about myself from that. From all of you, I'm kind of curious, as a white, middle-aged, heterosexual male, what can I do to help
have us on your shows and read our books?
You're doing
if you like our books, tell people you like them. That's all there is to it. This is the first time I've ever been on video with any show and said that I am a transgender person. I have never said that. On my podcast, I talk to a lot of queer people, and it's wonderful, and I love that. But I've never been able to say that to people. And the reason I'm even on here is because I like you. You're a really good guy, and I think that you do good things for authors and for other people. I don't feel threatened by you. I don't feel like we're in danger. I feel like this is a space that is safe for us to talk about real things, and that's what you do. That's what you got to do, man.
Appreciate that.
Yay, Jason! Better answers.
But I think a lot of people who are watching this or listening to this, something that they could do is to point out like bigotry or hatred. If they don't identify as something, they have an inherent safety that we don't. And if you're able to point something out, gently, like you don't have to be a jerk about it, but say like, hey, it's kind of like transphobic, or like, hey, that's a little outdated, because a lot of times we can't. It's not safe for us. If you're in a position to point that out, the people around you will really appreciate it. And I think too that you might be protecting someone that you don't even know that you're protecting. Because like Jason said, we don't necessarily always present in a certain way, and maybe we're not presenting in a certain way in that setting because we know we're not safe.
Yeah.
And it's really helpful when someone else kind of breaks that ice for you and lets you know whether or not you're safe without you having to out yourself.
Yes. Well, and I'll start my answer with an anecdote. The kindest thing that a male colleague has ever done for me is say, I think Olivia had a point there during a work meeting. So read our books as books. I mean, I write cyberpunk adventures. Yes, they have queer characters, but I write cyberpunk adventures with 80s jokes in them. So when you want to talk about my book, say, hey, I found this awesome book about fighting the corporations with 80s rock jokes in them. And if somebody, says something, then you can be like, yeah, there's queer characters. You had a point.
Yeah.
And so normalize it. Like, keep saying, hey, I found this book that has this, like, for my stuff, hey, I found this book with 80s rock jokes that has a fun found family in it, and things blow up. And for V's work, hey, I found this awesome lady archaeologist who's snarky as hell. You should read this. And just keep saying, hey, I found this awesome book. And don't put us in. I'm going to hit also in my answer on my third facepalm with that definition, literature. I'm not writing literature in the literature sense. I'm writing cyberpunk adventures. A lot of us don't want to be put in this special literature category. We want to write fun stories that people want to pick up and read, not because it's good for their moral fiber, but because they want to read an adventure. They want to read a fun story. I mean, we want to be out there and just be writing stories, not be in our special little room where everything is safe and wrapped in cotton wool. We want to be among the other stories just as another story. And if you say, okay, this is my line. If you say, I'm not really into romance subplots, totally cool. I'm not a BDSM person, but more power to the people who are. But if you say, I don't like this character because this identity, okay, now you're an asshole.
Yeah. I had somebody tell me once when they read one of my books, I don't really like Leslie. And I'm like, guys, come on. Really?
Fuck you.
One, it's not a porn book. I mean, it's very light scenes. And
Right,
this whole huge World War II plot that's amazing.
Well,
So, I mean,
wait till they get a hold of Flutter of Darkness. Then, Jesus, they think shit is crazy.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that's
right.
And Flutter it's 15 horror stories, and that's what I tell people about them. I mean, it's got all the stuff you'd expect out of horror. It's scary stuff, but it's my stories aren't always defined by who I am, even though a lot of me is in my stories.
Jason, you're awesome. I don't handle horror very well. So I probably won't read that one straight out unless I'm in a very specific mood and it's like noon on a June day.
But
I just don't handle it very well.
It's all happy.
But,
nobody dies, right?
No, they just go to yeah. It's just, and that's what I'm saying though. It should be about, hey, I like this, I don't like that. And that's totally fine. We should just be authors, not classified as this separate little thing over by itself. But I will read anything else you turn out because I think you're an awesome writer. You're a good enough writer. Let me put it this way. You're a good enough writer that I will have nightmares. This is the problem.
I'll tell you what, I'll send you a couple non-horror short stories, Olivia.
Yay! Thank you.